Tolkien has an internet reputation for hating everything he himself did not write, including Narnia, Dune, and notably Disney movies, which he specifically, quote, loathed, calling them disgusting, silly, and nausea-inducing. But internet reputations rarely tell the full story, because Tolkien also, quote, recognized Disney's talent, complimenting his movies' admirable and charming passages, as well as their beautiful external detail. To understand how something could be both beautiful and disgusting, we need to unpack Tolkien's 3 key criticisms of Disney movies. Criticisms that unlock the philosophy behind The Lord of the Rings. It all starts with money. Tolkien spent 17 years writing The Lord of the Rings, meticulously creating a fictional universe without hope or expectation of financial reward. In Tolkien's own words,
"Were you surprised at its success?"
Nobody made more staggered. Unless it was possibly Stanley.
In contrast to Tolkien creating art largely for its own sake, Walt Disney once asked the question, art? I looked up the definition once, but I've forgotten what it is. We just make a picture and then you professors come along and tell us what we do. Professor Tolkien was more than happy to tell us exactly what he thought Walt Disney was doing. Quote, Disney is simply a cheat, willing and even eager to defraud the less experienced by trickery sufficiently legal to keep him out of jail. Tolkien wrote this in 1964, shortly after the release of Mary Poppins and a public controversy in which its author accused Disney of adapting her story in bad faith. Tolkien thought Disney was unethical and greedy, but Walt himself said in 1933, quote, all this talk about my making a lot of money is bunk. Work is the real adventure in life. Money is merely a means to make more work possible. Regardless of whether or not that remained true, there is a clear contrast between the influence money had on the creation of their respective stories. Where Tolkien began writing The Hobbit as a bedtime story for his own children, Disney was once asked,
were your films principally designed for children?
Well, no, you have to appeal to the adult, or, the adults have the money, the children don't have any money.
Creepy laugh aside, can we really blame Disney for wanting to profit from the stories he created? Tolkien says yes, because his second criticism is that Disney didn't exactly create his own stories. Everybody knows that a lot of Disney movies are adaptations of classic fairy tales, and while we might not be too concerned about these stories, I challenge you to find anyone who cared more about fairy tales than J.R.R. Tolkien. But unlike other kids, Tolkien's interest in them never stopped, believing that, quote, if a fairy story is worth reading at all, it is worthy to be written for and read by adults. Not because adults have all the money, but because Tolkien viewed fairy tales as a legitimate form of writing that merely by accident have, quote, been relegated to the nursery. Because the adults do not want it and do not mind if it is misused. One of the misuses that annoyed Tolkien the most was the censoring or sanitizing of fairy tales. In one of his essays, Tolkien fondly remembers a fairy tale called The Juniper Tree by the aptly named Brothers Grimm. But despite its cannibalism, vengeful bird spirits, and family members murdering each other, The Juniper Tree had a profoundly positive effect on Tolkien as a boy. Quote, not of beauty or horror. It opened a door on other time, and if we pass through, though only for a moment, we stand outside our own time. Outside time itself, maybe. Tolkien viewed this effect as one of the prime functions of fairy tales, an effect he believed was only possible because of its horror elements, saying that, quote, without the cannibal stew and the bones which children are now too often spared in mollified versions of Grimm, that vision would largely have been lost, leading Tolkien to the conclusion that children, quote, should not be spared these details unless they are spared the whole story until their digestions are stronger. In other words, Tolkien thought that Disney's changes to Snow White destroyed Snow White. This is a little hypocritical, given that the Brothers Grimm themselves changed details to fit their own political and religious climate. But for the purposes of this video, it's pretty clear that to Tolkien, the only thing worse than sanitizing fairy tales is the result of sanitizing fairy tales. Because his third and most intense criticism of Disney has to do with what happens to stories when their details are pulled like teeth. Tolkien believed that fairy tales become simple and trivialized, exactly the kind of condescending one-dimensional stories for children that he always opposed. Tolkien criticizes the kind of storytelling tradition that Disney participates in for, quote, trying to be funny and failing, or trying to preach and succeeding.
Be a good boy. and always let your conscience be your guide.
In Tolkien's mind, Walt Disney trivialized the very genre and mythical species like dwarves that he wanted to legitimize through The Lord of the Rings. In 1946, Tolkien recoiled at a German illustrator who sent him, quote, Disney-fied versions of his characters, Bilbo with a dribbling nose and Gandalf as a figure of vulgar fun rather than the Odinic wanderer that I think of. Tolkien might come across as a little self-important here, but given the modern success of The Lord of the Rings, it's easy to forget that early in his career, Tolkien was toiling in obscurity while Disney soared to popularity. The Hobbit and Snow White were released in the same year, 1937, and in the minds of audiences, Disney's sanitized fairy tales were quickly becoming the definitive version of fairy tales. In 1939, Tolkien went on a movie date with Narnia creator C.S. Lewis to see Snow White in theaters. And despite every problem we know he had with the movie, he couldn't help but admit that the depiction of Snow White herself was, quote, beautiful. The proof was in the pudding that Disney clearly had talent, explaining how Tolkien could view his work as both disgusting and beautiful. Tolkien likely held the belief that the only thing worse than an enemy is a talented enemy. And so while he was pleased when The Hobbit became moderately successful over the next few years, Tolkien was anxious that his stories would eventually be co-opted like Mary Poppins or Snow White. His personal letters are littered with statements like he, quote, would not have given a film proposal from Disney any consideration at all. And even when it became clear that Disney himself wasn't going to touch Middle-earth, Tolkien was paranoid about Disney's influence affecting or infecting his work, saying that, quote, I really only feel anxious about one point. The dwarves and hobbits should not be made ridiculous in the Disney manner. Ironically, long after Tolkien's death, Disney Studios passed on the opportunity to fund Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, sparing us from the timeline where Disneyland opens Splash Mount Doom. But even if after all this justification you still think that Tolkien was needlessly harsh to Disney, I'd like to remind you that
needless were none of the deeds of
Tolkien
in life. We do not yet know his full purpose.
It's clear that without Tolkien's nitpicky criticisms, The Lord of the Rings would not exist. Because the only person who devotes his life to creating a fake world as detailed and meticulous as Middle-earth is also the person who thinks that Mickey Mouse is disgusting. If you want to know more about Tolkien's problems with Narnia and Dune, click here.